This is the second part of the lecture set, and we'll be talking about research versus our intuition and a little bit about trusting authority members. When it comes to intuition, there are a lot of times that our intuition actually works really well. It works fast and it works reliably. That being said, there are probably just as many times, if not more times, that there are situations where our intuition actually can lead us astray. And we'll talk a bunch of the ways in which it is systematically biased over the next several slides. But before getting into that, I just wanted to point out that when it does come to intuition, there are specific situations in which it works really well, and when those situations are not present, then it tends to suffer from the biases that we'll talk about much more acutely. Now, this is not the only place where intuition works reliably, but it is probably one of the most common. Now, that is when people who are using their intuition have received a high degree of training in whatever the domain is that they're using their intuition about. And not just any regular training, but training that allows them to experience multiple situations over a long period of time, along with very quick or immediate feedback about whether they were right or wrong in the decisions that they made. This is also just noting that this is a little bit of extra information, so if you don't need to internalize all of it, even though hopefully you do. One of the places we see this type of intuition at work a lot is when it comes to pathologists, people who diagnose diseases, nurses or RNs of any kind, and firefighters. So starting with firefighters, there is this phenomenon that takes place after people have been firefighters for a while, where they will begin to have a feeling about whether a building that is on fire is safe to go into or not. And when asked, many of these firefighters cannot give you specific reasons for why they think this. They just tell you that that's their intuition or that they feel that way. And in many instances, they are correct above chance, meaning that they're reliably able to infer which buildings are safe and not. And we see very similar patterns with nurses and pathologists who are able to very accurately diagnose illnesses and diseases in patients, but oftentimes when probed as to why they chose that specific illness or disease, they will oftentimes report that they just had a feeling based on the information that was available, or they had a feeling based on talking to these patients. And again, we see this remarkably high degree of accuracy. But now what makes these situations different than our general day-to-day use of intuition is the degree of training that these people have gotten and the degree of information about whether something is correct or not. So take one of the nurses or pathologists, for example. They make a diagnosis, and very quickly you will know whether that diagnosis is correct or not. And while we might not remember all of those instances slowly shape the neural network that is in your brain. I mean, your brain is technically a neural network, but basically it shapes how you look at the world. So we're going to talk a lot about how intuition is biased. I don't want you to start thinking that intuition is just bad across the board, but rather, like most things we will talk about, there are specific contexts where it works well and others where it does not. The first is probably around stories or statements that sound good or make sense to us. Now, human beings, I don't know if this is something that goes across to animals because of obvious language barriers, but we tend to believe stories and accept conclusions from them that come from stories or statements that make sense to us, that we can easily put together in our framework of the world, or are emotionally arousing. And we remember those statements, we believe those statements, and we accept conclusions from them at a higher rate than stories or statements that don't make sense to us or are rather dull. And this is actually one of the troubles that many science communicators oftentimes deal with, is they're trying to convey certain types of topics that are often quite complex and that will work against many common or lay theories about how the world works. And oftentimes those lay theories are much simpler to understand, and they fit much more with our intuitive understanding of how the world should be. And so there's often this bias that creeps up where it is harder to understand some of the more accepted reasons for why things happen, but not because of anything inherent one way or the other, rather just the complexity associated with understanding this way of looking at the world. Now, it's important to remember that this is not a matter of intelligence. It's not that there's some people who are smart enough to understand good science and other people who are not. Or it's not that some people are smart enough not to suffer from this good story bias, whereas other people are not. That's not how it works at all. People across the entire gamut of intelligence are all susceptible to this bias. Rather, what makes it so difficult is the amount of background and foundational information or knowledge that one has present. So an example of this is you could be the most genius person in the world, but if you had never learned any type of math, chances are you would have great difficulty trying to solve physics or rocketry problems. Just not because of your intelligence, but because you're missing certain foundational or fundamental concepts in order to continue on with your inquiry. And in the same way, when one is talking about stuff like evolution, for example, it's easy for us to say that all life came about and is the way it is right now because of evolution, but without a good understanding of how genetic sequences are copied, translated, suffer from mutations, and are selectively pressured from the environment, it's difficult to actually understand the way in which evolution led to all of the creatures that are either stationary or moving around on the planet today. Again, that doesn't have anything to do with intelligence. Now, relying on stories that make sense or just sound good can actually be really dangerous. So remember, please, the example about venting that we talked about in the previous lecture, whereby the common understanding is that venting about something will actually help us reduce negative emotionality, while the research actually indicates that this is the other way around. A more serious and even more troubling example of this is an intervention that is called critical incident stress debriefing. And this is a means for helping people, supposedly, to deal with traumatic experiences. And one of the biggest places where this was used was in September 11th of 2001 here in the United States, when the World Trade Centers were attacked. And what happened is, across a large portion of the country, many psychologists drove, because no one was flying at the time, to New York to offer this treatment to many of the survivors, because it was thought that this would help them mitigate their feelings of anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder that would no doubt arise from that traumatic situation. It wasn't until almost a full decade later that a large amount of research had been done on this type of intervention, at which point they showed that this intervention does not actually help reduce anxiety or post-traumatic stress disorder, and in many cases actually increases it. And the way this sort of intervention was structured was the idea that as quickly as possible after a traumatic experience, you get the person who survived and you have them sit for 3 or 4 hours and just sort of talk about their trauma and their feelings in order to sort of get that out, in much the same way that the common intuition was about venting, except in this case, they were sometimes exacerbating long-term and chronic illnesses, well, I don't know if you'd call it illnesses, but ailments, disorders, however you want to think about it, where they actually made things worse, which is exactly opposite of what they were trying to do. And this is one of the biggest dangers of just relying on stories without looking at the research behind it. Now, good stories are not necessarily bad, right? There are many times where good stories will be true, but what's important to remember here is that this bias exists in all of us. I mean, it's just, that's how it goes. There's no human being, as far as research has shown, well, okay, that's maybe too extreme. There might be a few out there. But for the most part, all humans suffer from this bias, whereby certain things just sound better to us and we will be more inclined to believe them. So the thing that is important to take away from this is just to critically examine claims. Do they actually make logical sense? Are they supported by previous literature? Have multiple different independent organizations or individuals corroborated and verified this information? And until such time, just be aware that we will rely otherwise on superficial cues, stuff like how exciting was it? Even though this is very difficult to actually do in practice, especially doing it regularly in day-to-day life. Finally, when research, especially a large body of research, conflicts with stories we have to explain phenomena or our understandings of the world, chances are that the research findings are closer to the truth than our stories about how the world works. Now, it's not going to be every single time that research is going to be better than some way that we explain something. There will always be those times where our feeling about the world actually turns out to be right later on down the pathway. But overwhelmingly, research will be closer to the truth than our personal opinions about the world. But remember, we talked about how research is probabilistic, so there are always those chances that this is not correct. And ultimately, that will boil down to this notion of many of us either know or have heard a person who knows a person or is one of our sort of grand members of our family who's smoked cigarettes for their whole life and is now 90 years old and totally fine. But how much are you willing to bet that you'll be one of those people who lives that long smoking a pack of cigarettes every day? Same thing by not getting heart disease by eating a stick of butter every day or something like that. So the next bias we'll talk about is the availability heuristic. And this is a bias in intuition in which people incorrectly estimate the frequency of something, relying predominantly on instances that easily come to mind rather than using all possible evidence in the evaluation of a conclusion. So one of the most common examples of this that we see in everyday life is people's fears around cars and airplanes. People overwhelmingly are more afraid of airplanes than they are of cars, even though the probability of dying in a car crash is actually 1 to 103, which is really bad odds actually. And the chances of dying in a plane crash are 1 in 11 million, which is astoundingly less than our probability or chances of dying in a car crash. So logically, it doesn't actually make sense that people are more afraid of airplanes than they are of cars, because cars are much, much more dangerous. I mean, we could say something like, oh God, 1,000, 10,000 times more dangerous or something like that. Now, why does this happen? Well, it happens because plane crashes are all over the news and car crashes are not. We don't really see that much about accidents in cars, whereas plane crashes make the news for several days. Even though this can also change. For example, if you're someone who listens to NPR or National Public Radio a lot, they have a traffic segment every half an hour or so where for 2 minutes they'll tell you about the traffic that's around where you live. And oftentimes they'll talk about accidents that have happened. And so if you listen to this regularly, your perceptions of car accidents will be higher than someone who does not. And this is all related to how easily we can call up memories or instances in our knowledge where we can estimate something. So when we think about plane crashes, it's easy to think about those situations because again, they're all over the news, they're terrifying, they elicit lots of emotions. Whereas car crashes, unless you see one on the road, you don't really hear about them that often. And because we're not always driving everywhere, you don't see that many car crashes. And so when asked to estimate, people drastically overestimate how many plane crashes there are and drastically underestimate how many car crashes. Now, this is a commonly studied decision-making heuristic in social and cognitive psychology, and this decision bias can be further exacerbated by strategies to selectively deploy and engage our attention. So either ways in which we can bias our own attentional system or situations or contexts that we find ourselves in around the world where others have either curated, manufactured, or manipulated the environment in such a way that our attention is selectively drawn to some things and not others. Because ultimately what we attend will be more remembered than things that we do not attend to. So an example that is present nowadays for almost everybody who especially uses smartphones will be news feeds or any kind of feeds that people tend to look at. Now, especially when it comes to news feeds, these will shape our conclusions about the world. Based on what stories we see, we will form conclusions about the current state of the world. But remember, these feeds are curated for each individual, right? Because of all the likes and dislikes that people push, not everyone is getting the same set of stories, which is fine when you're looking up recipes for cupcakes and banana bread, but one could argue that that's quite dangerous when it comes to actually reporting information about the current state of the world. Because what happens then when everybody's looking at different streams is that they tend to form different conclusions about the state of the world. And that in turn changes what they like and dislike, which can ultimately just keep exacerbating this problem, leading to people having wildly different perceptions of what reality actually is. So please note that this is a fundamental bias in just human beings, but it can also be manipulated externally, which is why today we talk so much about sort of this idea of an attention economy and where we devote our attention and what things are vying for our attention, because all of those things will ultimately selectively shape our interpretation of the world. Another bias is called the present-present bias, and this is a bias in intuition in which people incorrectly estimate the relationship between an event and its outcome, focusing on times the event and outcome are present while failing to consider evidence that is absent or harder to notice. So a place where we saw this was the bloodletting example from the previous lecture set, and either just think back to it or better yet review it, because I honestly think going through contingency tables is one of the most fundamental skills you could learn about your life if you would like to be a better decision maker. Now remember that of the squares in that contingency table, the conditions, right, when people were given treatment and recovered, given treatment, didn't recover, were not given treatment, recovered, and then were not given treatment and also did not recover are the 4 conditions. Now, all of those conditions are not equally available to us if we're just running around and not doing an actual experiment, right? As a doctor, we might see people who we give treatment to, but we don't ever see people we don't give treatment to because they don't come inside to the doctor's office, for example. And so how are we to know how many people actually naturally or spontaneously recovered? And it's not that we can't know it, right? You can go and do research and know it, or at least attempt to know it, but that won't always be immediately available. It will be some things pop up much more, like people who come in for treatment versus those who do not. And that will bias our understanding because we will tend to focus much more on the information that is immediately available to us and is easy to see. This is, again, very related to the accessibility heuristic. Another matter here, or that sort of mixes this with the idea of the good stories, is that not all of those conditions or squares are equally exciting. We're often much more excited when a treatment works than when a treatment does not work. Right? Or when someone spontaneously gets better versus they do not. Right? One, it's easy to be like, haha, a miracle happened, versus the other, not so much. Now, because they're not all equally exciting, our attention will be devoted to them in different ways, with differing amounts of attention to each of these conditions. And that will again change or bias the way in which we will make conclusions from the data we have available to us. Now, common examples of this in everyday life are the actually quite common experience of thinking about someone and then they call us, or I guess nowadays people don't call each other that much, they message each other, but I still think calling is kind of nicer. The other is when we dream about something and it actually happens soon after in real life. The most common of that, or the most common subset of that, is when people believe that someone will die and then they do. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about psychic powers or ESP and stuff like that. If you ever wanted to talk about it separately, sure, we can talk about that, but your beliefs and mileage, well, those are on you. When it comes to this is ultimately a manifestation of that bias. When we're thinking about someone and they call us, that is a surprising moment that is easy to remember and again is a good story because you tell them immediately after. In fact, where I grew up in Pakistan, we have a common saying for when this happens, and we tell people that their life is very long. It's just sort of a common way of expressing this idea of sentiment. Same thing about dreams. If you ever wanted to look at this, there is actually a statistical proof showing that it is more likely that every night someone will dream of someone they know dying across the planet than it is for every single human being not to have such a dream, because of the nature of our dreams and who we dream about and the likelihood that people do tend to die. So in all of these situations, though, we're not paying attention to the other pieces of information or the other possibilities, right? How many times did you think of a friend and they did not call you? Or how many times did they call you when you were not thinking about them? And those situations are just not as exciting and not as available in our memory as the few times in which we called them, or we were thinking about them and they called us, or vice versa. One sees the same pattern at green lights and red lights, where red lights are much more noticeable than green lights, and so we tend to focus and obsess on the fact that we got stuck at all of these stupid red lights, but we ignore the fact that we oftentimes cruise through. Yet another one, and probably one of the biggest ones to deal with in today's world, where information is already becoming so sketchy, and two, if you actually want to go into any type of research. This is the confirmation bias, and this is the tendency to consider only evidence that supports a hypothesis, including asking only questions that will lead to an expected answer. Now, while this might seem obvious and something to easily and definitely avoid, it is actually more insidious than it seems at first glance. So here's just an example to illustrate that. Think about how you would go about searching for something when you're interested in knowing what effects that turmeric would have on our physiology. Chances are you would go to Google or some other search engine and you would type one of the two following questions. Is turmeric good for me, or is turmeric bad for me? And I highly recommend trying this, because you'll see that this will lead to different search results that populate your search. And because those are now different, depending on what question you asked, you're likely to form different conclusions. So not only is this confirmation bias seen when we actually are looking at all pieces of evidence and giving preferential treatment to those that we like or that fit with our existing conclusions, but this happens already as soon as we begin to ask questions. And many of us rarely, if ever, think about the manner in which we ask questions, because most people just tend to assume that others will interpret it in exactly the same way. And for most of you who have had any kind of real relationships in your life, intimate or not, know that this is one of the primary sources of conflict in relationships, where someone says something or asks something that irritates or bothers the other person, only later on to come to the understanding that both of you heard that question in totally different ways, and it was the misunderstanding that led to the conflict. This is also why ultimately psychologists, especially those who do a lot of survey-based research, get training in question design and how to build good questions. Now, just for some extra fun information, people have actually done neurophysiological studies to show that more of your brain is actually lit up and excited and processing information that we agree with than information that we do not agree with. So this bias is seen on a sort of physiological level. There are tons and tons of studies to show that this actually takes place. And you can even see this when you have a debate in live sort of format, and you ask people to reflect on what were the good points about the debate. And if they had different points of view when they came into the debate, chances are they'll believe that there are different moments that were the highlights of that debate as well. The last of the biases, at least as far as that section is concerned in your textbook, is the bias blind spot. And this is the tendency for people to think that compared to others, they themselves are less likely to engage in biased reasoning or just be biased. And this is probably one of the most insidious and widespread biases that afflicts human minds. A common example of this can be found when asking a group of people to raise their hand or respond in some way about whether or not they're above average in some trait. So you can ask people about whether they feel that they're above average drivers, or they have above average intelligence, or they're above average cooks, or whatever the heck it happens to be. And in many of these cases, one will find that more than half of the individuals will raise their hands, which obviously doesn't work, because if more than half raise their hands, you no longer have a 50-50 split, which would be where your average would be. And a lot of this is also just because people don't want to be average, and that biases our interpretation of the world. We see this with grades all the time. No one wants a C, lots of people want A's, but the truth is a C was designed to actually be the average. A C was not actually something that was bad. An A was given for exceptional work, even though in today's world of educational institutions, That's actually not used that much anymore, where now pressures from universities and parents and students, and even just surviving the number of students that people have, along with laziness on faculty members' parts, I mean, many, many different things, has led to this sort of over-giving of high grades and avoiding of negative grades. I mean, the fact that people have quotas in classrooms is kind of crazy. Not to mention that in many cases now, you have people who look down on a C student, even though technically speaking, the way it was originally formulated, a C student is actually doing pretty well. They know more than 70% of the information, according to at least the grading rubric that we use in San Francisco State. But because of sort of our culture and the way we look at the world, that's just not acceptable to many of us. We're just somehow told that we should all be exceptional and that being average is somehow bad. But the truth is, most of us are average in most things. And that's just kind of how averages work. Another part that's strongly related to this is confidence. Now, just because someone says something in a confident manner does not make them right. In fact, it has been reliably demonstrated across much of psychology's literature that when people provide statements to us and they deliver them in a very confident manner, we're actually more likely to believe those statements than if they provide those statements in a sort of non-confident manner, I guess is the opposite. But the research has also shown that there's not really much of a connection between confidence and the actual truth value of a statement. That they're true statements that people will talk about confidently and not, and they're false statements that people will also talk about very confidently and not. And I'm pretty sure all of us know at least one human being who has just spadefuls of confidence but spouts just bullshit after bullshit. Excuse me. And not that they're bad people, it's just they can say stuff and believe it. And then we're more likely to believe it too because it sounds right if they're saying it from a point of confidence. But that's not necessarily a guarantee. A lot of studies have used mock court cases where they've demonstrated these types of phenomena before. All right. Moving on to authority figures. Technically, this is a different section, but I do feel like this kind of falls under biases when it comes to our decision making and understanding of sources. And two, it was just so short a section that I didn't want to make a separate lecture set. Now, authority members are probably one of the go-to sources for information because they're authorities and experts on the subject matter. And so why not get their information? Because that just makes sense. But now, just because somebody is an expert on something doesn't mean that they're immune to faulty information or sources or even reasoning. I mean, at the end of the day, we're all human beings for the most part and are all susceptible to these types of biases, even when we have training, even though that might mitigate it. So one of the best things you can do in this case is just as you would critically examine your own sources, hopefully, so too should you at least check the sources of authority figures when they're making or justifying their conclusions, and better yet, you'd actually look through them as well. Now, pretty much all modern science has sources, lots and lots of sources, and thus authority figures should use them too because those sources are present. When work is conducted without any type of sources in the current sort of academic fields, unless it is a groundbreakingly novel piece of work, it has to have citations because work will build on previous work. And even when you're doing something novel, you oftentimes talk about the other existing theories that existed before. And let's say somehow you've come up with an idea that has never even been thought of before and is not related to anything. As surprising as that would be, okay, sure, you could have a paper that was without sources. But even then, it would need to be given to other experts who could all collectively then review it and critique it. And until you had that kind of consensus, I would be very skeptical. Further, if authority members are presenting information to you and they do not present their sources or do not make them available or at least do not tell you where to get those sources, I would be automatically suspect of their reasoning. Another thing to just keep in mind here also is just because someone cites something in an academic paper does not mean the thing that they cited actually agrees with the way in which they cited it. There are unfortunately all too many situations where you can read a statement in an academic paper, see the citation, get really excited because that's exactly what you were looking for, only to read the citation and realize that what they did there has nothing to do with the way in which the paper you were originally reading actually tried to use that reference. The example from your textbook is, I think, just excellent. So this is referring to advice that a person who is an authority figure is giving people for when they're feeling angry. This person has an advanced degree, I think a master's degree. They wrote several books on anger management and actually have an entire business in this field. And the advice that they give people is punch a pillow or a punching bag. Yell and curse and moan and holler if you're angry at a particular person. Imagine their face on the pillow or punching bag. Vent your rage. You're not hitting the person, you're hitting the ghost of that person. Blah, 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 blah. This advice coming from an expert is directly opposite to the research we looked at in the last lecture slides, showing, demonstrating how taking part in this activity is actually just going to make people even more angry. It's not actually going to help them reduce their feelings of negativity. So just because an expert is saying something, even an expert in the field that they're talking about, doesn't guarantee that they're right. And double checking will never hurt in this way. So this brings us all the way back to research, and it is one of the reasons why there's really no substitute for actually going through the original research yourself, even though it takes way longer and is much more difficult than simply just taking someone's word for it. Because nowadays, many people don't even want to read anymore. I mean, there are people who will literally say, I don't want to read my reading assignment because there are too many words, which is, to me at least, kind of crazy. But it also is a demonstration of the times. But most academic research is still in paper format. And even that is not written in an easy way like you would read a blog post or a fiction novel. It's very, very dense, and it takes time to work through it and understand it. So we rely on our intuition and sort of our just base judgments and authority members all the time, because it would take forever if we tried to look up the research on everything we were thinking about. That being said, if it's something that means a lot to you, you should probably go look up the actual research. Also, not all authority members are equal, right? When they're making conclusions outside their domain of expertise, you should probably be pretty cautious in accepting their claims, because just because someone is a rocket scientist doesn't mean that they'll be able to give you accurate descriptions of genetic replication. Further, just because somebody is famous doesn't mean they know anything about what they're talking about. We see this all the time in today's world with celebrity endorsements. Just because a celebrity endorses something doesn't mean they know much about whatever that phenomena is. Now, this can be great for getting awareness, don't get me wrong, but when they're just making claims about how the world is and should be and actually works, well, verify first.